So hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's session. We're excited to be wrapping up our year, or actually it was 2 years of projectiology and discussing the book and out-of-body experiences together. So tonight's session is actually going to be our second to the last session. And then we're going to have one more meeting next month. So tonight's session, just a few admin things to go over. First of all, tonight's session will be recorded as we do have a few people in different time zones. So we have these recordings available on the Isaac YouTube page for anyone who has missed out on the live sessions. Now, during the session, feel free to unmute yourself at any time, or you can use the raise your hand or the chat functions if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Tonight's agenda is there will be around an hour of presentations by the facilitators, and then we will go into breakout rooms for about 10 to 15 minutes. And we'll stop the recording so that you can talk freely. You can ask questions about the chapters of the book. You can discuss the chapters or just share your out-of-body experiences or insights that you've had while reading the book. We understand not everybody has had the time to keep up with the reading. So, don't limit yourself to just, reading, talking about the chapters in the book. You can share whatever experiences that you have. Then we'll rejoin together as a group and have about 15 to 20 minutes of group discussion. And then we will present the technique that we'll be practicing for next month and close the meeting. So now I'm happy to present our facilitators for tonight. We have Dave Lindsay, who's joining us. Dave has a BA in English and a law degree and is a native of Aotearoa, New Zealand. He currently lives in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. and has been based in the U.S. for over 24 years. Prior to that, he spent 2 years in London and a year in the Caribbean. He works in data and technology consulting. From the late 90s until the mid-2010, he was an active volunteer and instructor of an organization that provided courses and workshops in the area of multidimensionality based out of New York, and led its office for 5 of those years, subsequently spending a year on its global board of directors. He has a research interest in will, existential seriality, and the lineage of consciousness through its holobiography, and how these things interact with issues of social justice, societal governance, and demilitarization. Our other facilitator for tonight is Jeffrey Lloyd. Jeff is an independent researcher of the neurosciences of projectiology and conscientiology and has been since 1996. He now resides in Australia and is involved in numerous projects to help internationalize conscientiology, including numerous translations. He has taught for various organizations within conscientiology, including IIPC, CEIF, IAC, Isaac, and Conscious, and has participated in numerous international congresses and symposias. So thank you very much to the facilitators for joining and all of you participants. And I'll hand it over to you, Dave.
Hey, thanks, Mashiko, and thanks so much for the invitation to help out. Hopefully, please let me know if you can't hear me. I'm using a microphone, so hopefully it'll be okay. So let me just share my screen. There we go. And I'll just say what a great pleasure it is to be doing this with my old friend Jeffrey Lloyd. Who would have known we would have come together? So lovely to be doing this, and also the people that are facilitating in Australia. Thank you so much for putting this together. And I call out to Kim McCall, who he and I were sort of initial students back in the late 90s in London. Correct, Mr. McCall? There are very few people pursuing these neurosciences at that time, and yet we managed to stumble across it in the dark alleyways of London. So great stuff. So what's that?
Who would have thought we'd be here now?
I know. So hopefully you can just see my PowerPoint. I've got a few things going. Is that visible for everyone? Yep.
But it's not in presentation mode. It's like in...
Okay, yeah, let's do that then. Let's do that. Lovely, thank you. That's all still good? Yep. Terrific. Thanks, guys. Okay, so moving swiftly on, the usual admonitions: don't believe in anything, experiment, have your own experiences. So diving right in. So here are the chapters that we've got for this month's set of information. You can see on the left here the ones that I'm going to be tackling, and then over on the right the ones that Mr. Lloyd will be tackling. So that's how the split is going to work out. Jumping on to the next page, just focusing on my chapters, there are quite a few chapters, as you probably are familiar with from each month. So there's a lot to get through. So I'm going to be prioritizing, and the ones that are in dark blue and bolded are the ones I'll spend a bit more time on. And then you can see the ones that are a bit more indented and lighter colored are the ones I'll spend less time on. There's still lots of really interesting things in there, but it's just a question of, prioritizing the time. So going in, first of all, to 474, lucid projection and war. So a lot of interesting things here. The idea is that one of the initial ideas is that explosions actually cause projections. So, the soldier in the battlefield, or a civilian in some cases, with fatigue, isolation, extreme physical and mental tension, these are all things that, can give rise to projections. And certainly even the violence and dislocation of the masses of air, because of the impacts, explosions and shock waves, these things also could facilitate projections. So and that could be either in the case that they actually die, so they project and then they die, right, because of the explosion, or perhaps they might not die, but they'll still have that kind of projection. So that's one of the observations. And then there's a bit of a paradox, really, is that lucid projections on the battlefield, are typically forced, and it could be for the reasons described, but also psychic trauma too, and other trauma. And the fear of death and the deliria caused by war, they actually are projectiogenic. They favor projection, which is the opposite of the normal case, where fear would actually be a blocker to lucid projection. Just by the way, how's my speed? Is it okay? Too fast? Too slow? No, probably not too slow. Okay. All right. Good. Thank you. So then, one of the interesting things that certainly it was more of a theme in the 90s, when this was, sort of published in Portuguese and then in English in the late 90s. And we don't hear quite as much about it now, but there's still, things that do come out in the news once in a while, or the odd book, is that, psychic abilities do get used as a weapon or some kind of an instrument of war. And so there's a lot of research done into PK, or psychokinesis. Certainly this was quite a big thing back in the 60s, and that kind of continued through the Cold War era, where there was the idea of using consciential energies as a weapon of war or sabotage. Synonyms could be mental warfare, psychic warfare, telepathic warfare, telekinetic warfare. And there certainly are, some valid examples of research that, have been documented. There are books written about these things, people that are on the lecture circuit that talk about their involvement in these types of things. And some examples would be discovering and locating military targets at a distance through remote viewing, finding hiding places for missiles. Then there's some examples in the category of extraphysical telekinesis. So, one possible, interesting one is the theft of documents through apport or the acquisition of secret mental material from other persons. Seems like quite an advanced one, but certainly possible. And also maybe a mental command to discharge combat equipment. So this presumably is when it's not, your equipment, it's another, adversary's equipment, I think would be the idea there. And then extraphysical telepathy will be another type that's used, a type of, ability that would be used to acquire secret mental material from other persons, even to change other people's minds, ideas, decisions, their sense of humor, or their mental balance rather, and their emotions. And then precognition, trying to anticipate plans that haven't been yet conceived or fully materialized by the enemy, and even inflicting illnesses through malign use of consciential energies. So these are things that have been done or certainly people have aspired to do them. And then, the author Waldo Vieira makes an interesting point that impressions made in the mental soma are more lasting than those in the psychosoma because they're constantly reproduced through memory and imagination. And so actually, that's one of the dangers of being a human in some ways, that with our more developed mental soma than, say, an animal, that the mental soma continually stimulates the psychosoma, awakening desires within it. And in some cases, those are desires that if we were an animal, they'd only be awakened by physical desire. So that thing wouldn't rise up as much actually as it can in a human. And he proposes that this is the basis for the calculated cruelty of animals. We're supposedly the superior animal, but we actually can potentially be more dangerous and brutally savage than other animals that are considered inferior. So that's kind of an interesting point, and it actually aligns with another book I'm in the process of reading right now by an author not associated with multidimensionality at all, but he's a returned soldier and talks about exactly this point, that we don't really realize the things that lie deep within that can be activated. So it's a pretty interesting point. And then there's a few things that I'll mention that I really quite like that Waldo's done in some of these chapters. And this is something that I hadn't noted previously when reading this, as the author protest. He records his vehement protest against the worrisome absurdity of war, irrespective of which war, that's generated by animal instincts and passions of modern humanity. The civilized barbarian, the greatest technical barbarian in human history. So he's really coming at us sort of fairly against war, which is really pretty nice. And then I know there's a few chapters here and there within Projectiology that talk about intrusion. It's not sort of a topic we go into a whole lot right now, just because of the other topics, but certainly regards war as one of the 4 things that's pretty intrusive in terms of a task you could be involved with in human life. So you've got war, espionage, sabotage, and intentional disinformation. And who knew 25 years later how big the last one would have become, right? Quite interesting. So yeah, the final paragraph, I won't read everything that I've got on these slides, but just wrapping up on this one, I wanted to spend a bit more time. He thinks it's really would be a great inoculation or a vaccine for commanders and troops to know the individual and deeper realities of the experiences of projection. It's really an inoculation against war, because it leads us to better control of the psychosoma, because we have more comprehension and a better use of their mental soma as we become more mature. So then that last sentence, again, it ties in with the author of protest, that he presents this work as his contribution against the savagery of war and all warlords. All right, any questions, remarks from anyone?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, it made me wonder a few things, this passage. I mean, I don't know, I have not read the chapter, so I just got to say that up front probably. But does he give examples of these kind of like lucid projections and telekinesis and so on being used in war? That's one question. And it's in the context of, so what I was thinking about, I was hearing what you were saying is how in indigenous cultures, psychic abilities are definitely very much part of feuds and disputes. And there is a very strong belief that enemies can attack other people psychically through telekinesis, causing injuries, causing illness, even things like maybe stealing sacred objects through projection, those kinds of things. And I guess we know through the course of history that cultures where these beliefs were strong, when they were confronted with Europeans who really didn't spend any time on this stuff but had better weapons, the weapons clearly, the material aspect of war clearly dominated the psychic paranormal aspect of war. So I don't know, that was just a thought that came up. And I guess in that context, I'm also, I guess, a bit more skeptical about the idea that knowing lucid projection would inoculate us against war, because cultures in which lucid projection played a really strong part would still use it for not necessarily ethical, purposes, but for the purposes of spying, attacking, causing harm or injury, those sort of things.
Yeah, I think you make a couple of, well, they're both, they're all very good points. The first one, just in terms of references, there are references in the chapter. I didn't have time to take a look and try and find them, while preparing for this. I mean, I have read some books on these topics in the past, and I've got one on sort of, behind the Iron Curtain, PK,
Yeah, that one.
yeah, all that kind of good stuff. So certainly there are things out there, but he didn't go into details in the chapter about, more specifics. So that's on that one. I think that's a really interesting point about the cultures that do use these powers, that they don't necessarily help them when they come up against more advanced armaments. That's right. So it's more of like a complementary aspect. You probably want to, if you're serious about the business of war, ideally you probably have a bit of both, right? If even in a defensive capacity, you could say, okay, I need to have some minimal defensive things, even though, I think peace would be ideal, but you have some sort of psychic protection, so perhaps it's even like a cosmo-ethical, defensive posture that's possible. I don't know. Yes, that's a very interesting point, you've raised there. So, and your third point was interesting too. So, lots of, fruitful material. Yeah. Great. Shall we continue? Yep.
I was just going to very briefly mention two other books that Waldo later wrote, Homo sapiens reorganizatus, which dwells into this kind of area, perhaps quite a bit more, and many other more pathological areas of human nature as well. And then just to sort of balance it out, there's Homo sapiens pacificus as well, which emphasizes more the more perhaps noble aspects of the human personality, just to drop those into the message here.
Yeah, that is a good point. Yeah. And I think I'm just doing justice to what you just mentioned about the projecting. I had a couple of questions too. There's a couple of other chapters too where I think he mentions, the projection is going to solve this, and I think it's sort of yes, but, okay, it will, but with a whole lot of other things about maturity and cosmoethics, and it's not going to be the only thing that is going to be the solution to these things. I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then into more positive, uplifting themes, we're going to talk about lucid projection, espionage, and business. So these things, do exist too, that the espionage within, espionage itself, right? And then lucid projection in the context of business, typically from more of a negative sort of standpoint. Certainly, I've come across cases of these types of things. There are books about the espionage side of it more so. So maybe just go through some of the things that Waldo had in the book here. The more neutral observation he made, which I think is interesting, is that extraphysical espionage is a public application of lucid projection, and that some such applications can be exceptionally positive, while the majority are negative. So it could aim to serve industrial, military, private, police, political, journalistic, or any intelligence-related secret service, so they can be of benefit to those sorts of, groupings of activities, right? To investigate the privacy of intraphysical consciousnesses, institutions, and public areas, and even to create efficient anti-telepathic barriers. So it's really based on quite an interesting principle, which we've all thought at one time, but then you sort of forget about it, and then it's interesting to read it again. That extraphysical espionage is based on the principle that no secret can really be secure, right? In light of the universal possibility of one's consciousness's perceptions interfering upon another's through projection. Sorry, one consciousness, as I meant to say. So certainly this is the case, and governments and major powers, aim to use projection as a sophisticated espionage method for probing military, political, industrial archives, and even sort of getting into the mind of military leaders, political leaders, embassy personnel. So this is something, again, you know, being with respect, I wonder if this was more of a thing in sort of the Cold War era and coming out of the Cold War. I haven't been seen as much about this in the last 15, 20 years, because obviously we've got things like technology advances now that maybe been more fruitful than these, but I don't think they're not happening either. So I just want to qualify that. It's certainly, you know, I don't think anything will be off limits in terms of some of the programs that were begun, you know, would most likely would be continuing, but just I'm personally a bit less aware of them right now. So, you know, he makes reference to the fact that some countries take seriously and spend huge sums on the creation of their own team of invisible men, which is quite a nice phrase. It could be invisible women too, of course. And then he also talks about counter-espionage being more complex in this situation. So, you know, you've got counter-espionage for, you know, you're being spied on, you're trying to find out if you're being spied on. It's much harder in this context to have telepathic counter-espionage. You've got to be very lucid and aware. You've got to have a really good sense of your psychic signals and whatnot to know what might be going on. And obviously a majority of people in the types of positions that would be spied on would have less information, you know, to be able to detect that these sorts of things were happening to them. He makes reference to, you know, a few well-known experiments that have taken place, or actual investigations. So there's one that's quite well documented, where the CIA, in conjunction with Stanford, used a couple of psychics, Ingo Swann, who's a painter and a psychic, and Patrick Price, and the parapsychologists involved were, you know, mentioned on the page there. Russell Targer's, you know, written quite a bit about this especially, and they were able to precisely describe top secret military installations and confidential archives. There was a description of an installation in the Ural Mountains in the former Soviet Union, and there was other espionage done to China, and in both cases, you know, CIA contacts on the ground were able to validate the accuracy of what was being perceived. And then this seems like a bit of a like a sort of a personal challenge type one. The final paragraph, it mentions the possibility of by teleportation, whereby you could actually copy blueprints or other documents. You could project to another country, but actually it'd be a teleportation, because you would materialize yourself at the other site, you know, grab the documents and then dematerialize yourself in the documents, bring them back, copy them, and then do the same in reverse to get them back into place undetected. So, you know, Kim McCall, perhaps that's a challenge for you. You can let me know when you've successfully achieved that goal in your psychic development. So moving on to the next slide. Yeah, so he refers to police investigations, and this is something that is quite well, you know, we do still see a lot of that going on. You know, various documentaries and exciting specials on Netflix and whatnot about this type of thing, where projectors or other sort of types of psychics have helped to track missing or kidnapped persons, perhaps locate a crashed aircraft, or even examine a crime scene and identify something new that hadn't been identified before. So these can be positive uses. And he does sort of emphasize that, you know, anything that's on, if we're using it negatively or unethically, you know, there will be implications for us, you know, karmically speaking. You know, there's other examples. He talks also about companies or law firms that, you know, use spy projectors perhaps to locate reserves of minerals or natural gas, that type of thing, or to try and forecast pricing on precious metals, that type of thing. And then one final one I'll mention here would be that certainly in the Soviet era, there was a lot of research focused on influencing or controlling the emotions or behavior of people at a distance, trying to act on the frequency and intensity of their brain waves through the energetic impulsion of the will rather, to, you know, direct them towards what their goals were. So, you know, even though it's psychic, he still sees it as a very, you know, materialist approach, you know, consistent with Marxism, you know, which was obviously the prevailing spirit of the times, politically speaking. So, but it's still going to achieve the same goal, even if it was materialistic. You know, it was a combination of the psychic and the materialistic. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. And you see these embassy situations once in a while where someone gets very unwell, You know, I remember when I first started hearing about those, I thought that seemed kind of interesting, and it seems more likely that there's actual physical apparatus, you know, that's been used to sort of make people unwell. So, you know, various, you know, is it UV, not UV, I can't recall which one it is right now, but there are various actual physical non-visible spectrums that can cause an impact. So
I think they're using like ultrasonic kinds of things now.
Yeah.
And,
I think
yeah,
that's right.
stuff like that.
Yeah. Great. Any questions, or should we move on? Lovely. So I'll just go a little bit more quickly on some of these chapters. They're really interesting ones, and you know, quite relevant, and I think even more relevant in some ways. Not more relevant, but we certainly, with you know, the blossoming of this new era of visual entertainment, you know, we certainly, whether it's your Netflix or your Hulu or Prime or, you know, you name it, there's just a million shows, movies, documentaries, you know, the whole spectrum, with sort of multidimensional themes and people with superpowers that typically include flying and becoming invisible and different things like that. So it's all, you know, quite interesting. But overall, you know, he makes the, you know, the valid point that a lot of, you know, artistic creations have been, you know, sponsored by, you know, sort of maybe, you know, just they come from a place of having projected and having had experiences, and then trying to bring that, you know, into some sort of a creative form. So there's a ton of novels there, in multiple languages. Certainly Louis Lambert is always kind of the flagship one that's heavily, you know, mentioned as one that's, you know, very projectiological in themes, but there's a few others there. Farewell to Arms, Ernest Hemingway, a couple of other gems there. But then if we move on to other areas, there's poetry, opera, paintings, comics. So, you know, quite a spectrum. Certainly, you know, one of the more well-known of those would be William Blake, you know, poet and painter, who, you know, has really, you know, quite stunning, you know, works of art, you know, paintings, especially is what I'm thinking of right now, that, you know, they are clearly multidimensional in their origin. So, you know, interesting to take a look at that. And he has a call out to the Center for the Higher Studies of the Consciousness down in Brazil, where there are examples of the above works and many other works, you know, that involve projectiological phenomena. It's kind of interesting, just as a at a point in time, he mentions comics, you know, the Phantom, Doctor Strange, X-Men, you know, these things, you know, who would have known that it's become such a huge genre, you know, on the screen, and people mad about these things that do have projectiological things now. So then just a couple of specific art forms we can go into here. So music would be one, right? So we can sometimes hear music when we're projected, and it's very sort of like, you know, transcendental music is one of the synonyms he gives in the chapter, but it can be quite interesting where we might not identify any sort of origin. You know, it's hard to kind of sort of see anyone who might be singing it or playing it, or you know, where it's sort of coming from. And it can kind of be more sort of a constant set of tones rather than, you know, what we would think of as normal music, but it's definitely, it is musical. So so this is sort of an interesting phenomenon, and it can often sort of, as he mentions there, it can often exist and imminently endure, regardless of, you know, what consciousnesses are there, right? So interesting. And just in the final bullet about music, he just mentions that it's particularly used as a support for psychic self-relaxation or mental concentration by novice projectors. So it's a good thing to think about, you know, if we want to be nice and calm. Then over on the right, talking about the theatre, just, you know, this is a pretty short chapter, just mentions that, you know, sometimes appearing on a stage, whether we're speaking, acting, dancing, singing, whatever we're doing, can often trigger a projection. So it's a very psychosoma loosening type of activity. You know, there's a lot of energy being exchanged with the audience, a lot of non-alignment sometimes. You know, if you're playing an historical figure, there's inspiration coming from other dimensions sometimes. So it's a very, you know, it's certainly an area that could, you know, be quite a loosener of your bodies, let's say. So it's probably enough on that. And then there's one final bullet. He mentions that, you know, there are cases of spectators who are motivated by inner exaltation at their involvement in the art of the actors on the stage have lucidly projected to the ceiling of the theatre house. So yeah, quite an interesting thing. Questions, comments, anyone? Okay, so jumping on then. So lucid projection and so it's very early in the morning here. I haven't had coffee, so it's quite hard to pronounce multi-syllabic words such as that. We're talking about movies, right? And he mentions a couple of movies here, and we could add, you know, probably 50 or 100 to this now. As I was mentioning earlier, you know, there's just been an explosion of really interesting movies, documentaries, series about these types of phenomena. But he calls out beyond them back. And I did find this on YouTube when, you know, preparing for this, and so it is out there and well worth a look. I've got it queued up ready to take a proper look through it over the next few weeks. It looks interesting, right down to the exciting scene setting 1970s music to elicit tension in the audience at what is about to ensue. So yeah. And then he talks about Jonathan Livingston's Seagull, you know, based on that, you know, really nice short book by Richard Bach, which is, you know, a fantasy or a parable about a seagull that sort of wants to go further, wants to go higher. So it contains lots of projectiological, you know, phenomena. Any questions or comments? Okay, great. So then moving on, the next chapter in my group here was about lucid projection and nephology, which is the study of phenomena and events that are said to exist or occur, but for which there is not a scientific explanation, in some cases not yet one, and encompasses quite a broad grouping of some natural sciences, pseudosciences, alchemy, astrology, Kabbalism, witchcraft, magic, numerology, possession, superstition, and ufology. So quite a broad range there. And I think he quite sensibly doesn't try and go into too many of them, but focuses more so on UFOs, which, you know, he considers to have quite a strong connection with lucid projection. And I think there's some, you know, good reason for that. That there's not that they're the same types of phenomena necessarily, but there's maybe the ability to have a bit more, you know, interaction with the possibility of such things when not limited by the sort of technical constraints we currently have on the planet, you know, of, you know, physical apparatus to travel and have in-person meetings, etc., etc. So what he notes, interestingly, is that people, you know, do report contact with UFOs through lucid projection, and he thinks that those reports favor the hypothesis that a lot of these types of phenomena actually do occur in another dimension, and that perhaps people are a little bit confused when they report an abduction or something, but actually it was something that happened to them non-physically, and that would, you know, account for some things. And so he notes some similarities between what projectors report and what abductees report. You know, there can be amnesia over entire periods, instantaneous translocation across vast distances, you know, suddenly feeling as though you're on another planet, or, you know, far away from Earth, looking back at Earth, things like that. A sense of paralysis, which is a bit like the catalepsy we have when we're, you know, just exiting our body, or, you know, coming back to our body and unable to move it. The appearance of lights of various colors and manifestations, and sometimes having forms that emanate from them, floating bodies, extra physical or non-terrestrial locations without corners or straight lines, and then beings with a different form to humans, sometimes with larger eyes and sort of the more cliched view, telepathic dialogues. Yeah, so I think I'm not going to read through all of these, but certainly there's some parallels, and that's kind of interesting. And that, you know, perhaps, yeah, I think I've made the point already that perhaps a lot of these things are not happening in this dimension. You know, that the experience the person is having is actually something in another dimension. Yeah. I think there's a further case. I was hesitating to say it, but I will say it. It's not a big dramatic point, but is that sometimes a person might think they're having a UFO type contact, but they're just having some sort of a multidimensional experience. So there's sort of maybe a bit of confusion too. And then, you know, there's slightly, oops, I'm just jumping ahead inadvertently. So it's, you know, you can say that it's speculation, and it is, but it's also, you know, a fair mathematical point too. He observes that there are stars billions of years older than our planet, and that therefore it's easy to see that advances that can occur in a civilization a billion years older than ours, which is 10 million centuries, is far beyond the limits of our imagination, you know. So again, that is a kind of speculation, but, you know, it's fair that, you know, if there was life on, you know, in number of planets, certainly some of that life you would expect, you know, would sort of get through its risk of blowing itself up or destroying itself through climate change, and maybe get to a point where it actually would be a very advanced civilization. So that's what he's basically saying here. Any questions on that chapter? Great. So then moving on, lucid projection and the theta phenomenon. So this wasn't actually a phenomenon that I was familiar with until researching for this chapter, but very specifically in this context, the definition is the survival of the personality, the continuation of the consciousness after biological death, or the you know, death of the human body. And essentially, he's got, you know, he's sort of summarizing some of the forms of proof that we can have that we do survive biological death. And so the types of evidence there, first is the evidence is that we have multiple bodies, right? So we, you know, through the fact that we have multiple bodies, we obtain proof that we survive physical death. You know, we have a projection, we realize we've got a psychosoma, perhaps we even have a mental somatic projection and see our psychosoma and our physical body, and then it's completely unambiguous, the full spectrum of the bodies that we have. And then self-bilocation. So, you know, when we are able to, you know, go off and operate, do things without a human body, it's again pretty good evidence that probably we're going to be just fine when our biological body finally dies, right? That we're going to continue to exist. And then this goes further when we meet people who we know who have died. So this is definitely something that becomes a bit more unambiguous. And, you know, they can even have, you know, confirming things that they could say or that could pass between us that could help us further validate that it's a real experience that we're having, that it's definitely them and that they survive. So probably we're going to survive too, right? And then the last one there, the desoma observation, having the chance to observe, maybe even get involved with, you know, somebody else's death. We can sometimes help when someone is in the process of dying. And so this is the kind of thing that would be a very direct, you know, realization that the person continues to exist. You know, if we see their psychosoma, you know, separating from their physical body, for example. So just summarizing at the end there, he mentions that lucid projection eliminates preoccupation with death and thanatophobia, helps the person calibrate their life and priorities and values based on a paradigm that they will continue to exist after biological death. So I think your point earlier, Kim, I think that's it's all contextual. So I think some societies, you make a really good point, do this, you know, but maybe there's, you know, still some apprehensions, you know, perhaps not, that's not even a good example, because it's more maybe in a Western society, people could have lucid projection, but still not really know what it all means. But certainly, I think when you've got some information and the experience, it becomes, you get pretty comfortable that, you know, you should just keep chipping away and have a good life and know that this is not the only life you're going to have, right? So, yeah.
Could I jump in for a question, Dave? Just
yeah,
the term theta phenomenon, like, is that in what context is that used?
Yeah, I mean, I struggled to find a good reference for it. So, and I think, again, that's one of the problems, you know, with the internet, is that it's so, yeah, it's a pretty common word in different contexts, you know, sort of, you know, mathematical or fraternities or in other languages, you know. So I found it pretty hard to get a good source for this specifically.
Waldo doesn't explain it in the chapter, though.
No, it didn't seem to. Yeah, hence why going off looking. Yeah, I think it might have been a way that that it was used sort of in some of the research in the 60s and 70s, as much as I can surmise, but I haven't got a confirmation yet.
Yes, theta, it's a death, right? It's the theta. I don't know if it's the, you know, the brain wave.
Okay. Yeah.
That is related to death, where
Yeah.
there is no waves anymore. That's just a line. And so maybe it's theta phenomena because it's related to the death.
Yeah, that was my thinking as well, the association with that.
Yeah. No, yeah, it probably is, guys. Yeah, I just didn't have a chance to sort of dig as deeply as I would have wanted to into that, but that makes some good sense. And he does mention.
I mean, Wikipedia tells me that theta waves relate to learning, memory, and spatial navigation. So I don't think they're death states.
I don't know.
Also, theta waves are also quite connected with having projections, and projections often referred to as like a mini death, right? Obviously one you come back from typically. And so, yeah, that's why I was making the association. I'm not sure Wikipedia is going to give you too much about the connection between theta waves and out-of-body experiences. But
I know, it's one of the problems with the modern internet, isn't it? And now ChatGPT, forget about it. It's never going to, it's definitely going to bury any of those thoughts, but I digress. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So this is a bit of a big old chapter, so I'm just looking at time here. I don't want to use up all your time, Jeff. If I go, how much longer should I go for? Like 5-10 minutes?
Yeah, Dave, if you could wrap it up in 5 minutes, that'll give us some time for a bit of discussion later.
That's good. Yeah, so I'll be a bit quick. So there are 2 chapters to go. This one's got a bit of meat to it, and then the last one has a bit of meat to it too, but I'll still go quite quickly. But this is a chapter I would recommend taking another look at if you get a chance. It's quite long by the standards of the book, but it covers a lot of ground, and so essentially a lot of the book is about projecting and different dimensions and so on, and then this is kind of all about the theory of successive intraphysical lives. Right, and essentially, I think we all know what that means. It's the form of the survival in which the consciousness returns to human body, human life using a body, right, after having experienced biological death or desoma of its previous body, and after having passed through a period of existence in the extra-physical dimension. So it's this cycle of resoma, desoma, intermission. Yeah, and he postulates, accurately, based on my sort of sense of things too, experience and whatnot, is that all consciousnesses pass through this, plants, insects, other animals. So regardless of their evolutionary level, that this is a process that all consciousness, all life passes through as it evolves. So I'm just going to try and really pick out anything that's maybe more crucial here. Those of you who have been reading the book over this time and are familiar with Conscientiology, a lot of this isn't going to be very new for you, but it's all really nice stuff to see coming together in this chapter. So yeah, he certainly thinks that in fact, I'm not going to spend any time on this. It's just a very general chapter that you can read later or in the book itself, right? So, but going to the next page, talking more about past lives, he hypothesizes about recalling past lives that there's a non-random sequence for recollections, whether of one or successive existences, controlled by laws or agents that are as yet unknown. And he thinks that certain key factors remain hidden until we learn things from lives that we've already recalled. So if we've recalled one or a few lives, the idea is we'd probably need to really understand those lessons from those lives, and that will then kind of lay the groundwork for us to have more retrocognitions, right? And then mentions things like if we manage to sort of have an identification of ourselves as a past figure who was well known, it might be a bit tricky to disclose that publicly. Sometimes better not to maybe say anything about it. You know, the past can't be changed. It might not be productive to worry about the fact and create additional problems for yourself, is one of the things he mentions in the book, which was quite interesting. And you know, he makes the point, which is I think a nice one, that the purpose of the, you know, projection is the gradual elimination of the need to undergo resoma. I don't know if I completely agree, but it's interesting that the more we project, the more we're going to have awareness that's then going to ultimately mean that we don't have to resoma because we are advancing through the evolutionary process. One interesting thing here, he speculates that the average inhabitants of a planet, beginning with the eruption of the psychosoma, and you know, meaning like it's kind of emerging, the psychosoma, who they are as an extra physical consciousness, is coming through into who they are in physical life, right, in their physical body. They continue to make both the surrounding extra physical and physical dimensions more and more similar as planets get more advanced and as we become more advanced in an evolutionary level. So at a certain point on a really advanced planet, he's kind of postulating you're going to lose your need for intraphysical lives because you're so advanced that what you are able to do in the physical dimension is very similar to what you do in the extra physical dimension, and so on. So that would be kind of a pretty nice place to visit. Go for a vacation, get an Airbnb in that place for a few days and sort of see what it's like. Don't know if that would be very possible, but interesting. Let's move quickly. So then talking about, he has some numbers here, and I've just updated them slightly in terms of, you know, getting us up to an 8 billion population. What this table's got a bit of information on it. Essentially, what he's saying is that, you know, everybody has projections, but the vast majority, 80% of people, you know, it tends to be a bit more on the non-lucid side, and it's really only about 20% that are starting to have semi-lucid projections, 1% with you know, lucid continuous projections, and then a very, very tiny projection are just continuously, you know, aware and, you know, able to live a life that's not restricted at all by the physical body. So there's a lot more to this in the chapters, but you know, and I think I remember asking questions about this, you know, back in the day, and I think this is kind of postulated based on extra physical sort of interviews and intuition and, you know, mediumship type activities. I don't think there's been like a census done or something or a formal study, but you know, it's a framework to kind of start with, right? And this is more about having multiple lives. So, you know, some quite interesting principles about, you know, the fact that we can have lots of different kinds of careers. We could be a philosopher, an artist, a business person, politician, you know, all as part of the mix of who we are in our various lives, and that we, you know, tend to kind of re-encounter the same people, you know, across multiple lives, little by little, refining and improving, you know, how we are until we get a little better. So there's more to look at here, but let me just move on in the interest of time. This is again a lot more about the I'll briefly mention that first bullet about animals. So he just goes into a little more detail. His observation so far is that rebirth for animals tends to stay within the same species until it advances to a point where it can inhabit a new species. And maybe if there's a species that isn't quite the right fit on this planet, then, you know, it could maybe be part of a species in another planet, he postulates. And I think this particular chapter didn't call it out very much, but he refers to sort of seeing extra physically some, you know, animal forms that had a visual appearance different to any animals on Earth. And he sort of, his hypothesis was that perhaps they were animals sort of either, you know, maybe waiting for the right maturity of consciousness, you know, to physical vehicle to be available for them to be reborn into, was, you know, part of his hypothesis, either here or on another planet. Interesting idea. The rest of this is about, you know, as we have more references from past lives to compare ourselves to, we're in a position to, you know, understand, you know, some of the things that we would want to, you know, think about going forward. You know, we would start to become a bit more immune to criticism, as one example that I found interesting. because we might hear criticism or praise of that prior personality a lot, and so we start to kind of blank out a bit and get a bit less excited about what people are going to be thinking about us, recognizing that it's always going to be a bit of a mix of opinions. So there's lots of interesting things on this slide, so I do apologize that I say that then move on, but Michiko is very tough, you know, so I have to keep going. So then, and this is, I like this, I'm just going to spend 30 seconds or so here. Most of you who have read this book before or familiar with it would know this fact that Waldo used to hold up this book as sort of as a time capsule for him to remember who he was in his next life. That basically it's like you know, he's sort of publicly confessing that that's one of the things, one of the goals of this book is that he'll discover it in his next life, or in some form. It might be electronic or something different. And that there's different codes and numbers and names and things that he thinks he's going to see those things and go, oh my goodness, this is my book, you know, so that's kind of interesting. And then this is my last chapter here, so I'll just get to the essence of this one. Let's see if there's anything else here. Existential series, so very related to what we've been talking about, but more in the context of the, you know, karmic aspects, which are extremely interesting. Ego karma being the karma we have with ourselves, you know, the things we need to improve, the good things we've got. Group karma, the account with others, and then polykarma. And I hadn't noticed this previously until coming back to it now, that he correlates ego karma with our inner life, group karma with our private life, and polykarma with public life. I think that's quite an interesting way of thinking about karma. And then there are interesting criteria for how long we're going to spend between lives. And you know, those of you who have read this book will be familiar with this, but it is kind of interesting. Some people, you're kind of you know, you're a bit of a prisoner of your group. You know, you're tied to some people, and so you've got to go back in and have another life. You know, when it's time to sort of go together and sort some things through, and so that means that the period of time you spend in the intermissive period could vary. This complementarity principle is a bit more targeted to those who maybe either indirectly or directly committed suicide. You know, so if you're sort of a very heavy drinker, or you drive very fast and suddenly you die young, for example, then maybe a shorter intermissive period is prescribed to sort of start to little by little value lives a bit more. Activity is the one, this criteria is, if a consciousness is a bit more advanced, they tend to be a bit more useful outside the body as a helper, and so they would have a longer period of time extra physically before returning to a new life. Yeah, and then equality, this is a bit of a catch-all where people who are a bit more, they've got ego karmic debts, you know, their own issues, but not so heavy as some group karmic ones. You know, they might just have an equivalent amount of years, so 50 years of life, 50 years extra physically, for example. That's really it. I think one final thing I'll just mention and then hand over to the esteemed Jeffrey Lloyd, is that this is still a model. I really like the fact that he ends this chapter saying it's a model, basically. He invites us to observe the logic, rationality, and discernment he's tried to apply to that framework, but recognize that it's a model. And if we don't agree, or we find it a bit simplistic, then to try to advance it or come up with a fresh model, which is, you know, I think a great approach. Terrific. Thanks, Michiko. And I'll head to Mr. Jeffrey Lloyd. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. It's been a pleasure to hear you presenting again. I am just trying to share my screen here and really struggling to actually. Michiko, are you able to share the presentation again or not again? I'm not managing to actually share my screen, so I don't know what's happening there. Or Dave, do you want to bring it up? And
Yeah,
I
can do that, sure. Yeah.
Thanks, mate.
So PowerPoint, there we go. Okay.
So just go to the next one for me. Here we go.
Yep.
So this one is actually interesting, and it was referenced on an earlier one that Dave gave. It's around the continuous projection. So leaving your body and maintaining your lucidity. So you're within your body like we all are now, most likely, and then lying down, or could even be walking, but much more commonly lying down, and feeling all the process as you leave the physical body and have an out-of-body experience or a projection. And so what was it? 0.001% of the population probably has this. And I'll let you read the slides, and I'll try to add a bit of color just in my own discourse. I had this like 3 times in a short sequence of time, right back at the start when I started to study projectiology back in, was it the 90s? Late 90s. And after the 3rd one, I mentally accepted, okay, I get it. I accept the theory of the multiple bodies and out-of-body experiences and projections. And since then, I don't know if I've had it again. Like it was sort of like seemed to have been a sponsored kind of activity on my behalf to help me appreciate the reality of these things. So move it from just being a theory to actually understanding and having those experiences lucidly. And there was complications in that, particularly around the issues with breathing, right? So the first few times it was starting to happen, I got panicky or just weird things happening with my breathing because I thought, oh, I'm going to stop breathing or this and that. And so the panic stops the process. So there's interesting things there as well. But it's noted here that it's, you know, it's the first individual and inevitable step for us, each of us, towards achieving the state of continuous self-awareness. So irrespective of the dimension where you're manifesting, whether it be physical or extra physical, so you're out of the body and you're in a more subtle dimension, and those dimensions are like overlaid with us, right? So hence the influences, and we'll see another chapter talks to that a little bit more later. So we go to the next slide. Doesn't look like I'm able to control it. So this is just more on the same idea here. He mentions a few historical personalities who have seem to, in his opinion, have had these experiences and the subsequent kinds of changes in attitudes and perspectives in relation to life and the continuity of life and after physical death, for example. Next slide, Dave. I'm going to sort of rocket through a few of these. So this one I took some liberty in updating. Projectiology was written in the probably late 80s, published in the early 90s in Portuguese, translated in late 90s into English. He continued adding to the scale of the state of continuous self-awareness, and he did that primarily through the Conscientiogram. And we've got an updated version of the Conscientiogram there. That's the cover of it, and there's a download link there for you guys. And he talks in there, he actually fleshes out. So originally it was 7 steps that he talks about on the scale of the state of continuous self-awareness. And he fleshes that out as he went older and his research matured more and he went through more experiences. He actually fleshed that out to sort of almost 14 different steps. And there's still more, like the suggestions of many more possible gradations in there. Just briefly mention the stages influenced by 3 basic factors: human, so the improvement of the vehicle of manifestation, and the utilization of chronological time, which was kind of interesting, the importance of how we use our time in relation to the level of evolution or skill or adeptness that we have in utilizing our vehicle of manifestation. And then extra physical, so the relationship between evolutionologists who are quite evolved consciousnesses, same as us, they're just a bit smarter, wiser, or a lot smarter and wiser, and more experienced in relation to evolution, and assistance and the means of assistance, particularly interdimensional kind of assistance in this particular regard. And then consciential, at the essence of who we are, the evolution of the memory and the application of cosmoethics. Next slide, thanks, Dave. Here's an updated sort of scale of the state of continuous consciousness. And you can see there is this more granularity, I suppose, in the level of things there. I'm not going to dwell a lot on those. There's an awful lot of research and work and discussion around each of these different states and how to manifest, or what are the characteristics which are more predominant when an individual manifests more around these different levels. And it's just interesting to see the level of pacification, the increasing level of projectability and multidimensionality that manifests in the day-to-day of these consciousnesses at the more evolved level. Also the priority of interassistance, the knowledge of past lives, the knowledge of evolutionary mechanisms that it seems all consciousness within the universe and wherever adhere to in their own way. Could be in different shapes, forms, on different planets and all that kind of stuff. But it seems that we're trying to capture a general overview of the evolution of consciousness in different conditions. And that's what the Conscientiogram mentioned previously really does talk a lot to, and is a very rewarding / challenging book to review. So I can recommend that for sure. Next slide, please, Dave. So this is, like you may have noticed at the very end of that list of the scale of consciousness, there was a free consciousness, and the free consciousness was
sorry, Jeff, I'm just there we go.
Okay, yeah, bring it back out. You're all good. I've got it here anyway. So the free consciousness is essentially when a person has discarded all the denser bodies. So we have on the picture there, well done, lovely. On the left-hand side, you've got a representation of the hollow soma, or the set of all of the bodies that we all are manifesting through here and now in this dimension. Our physical body, our energy body, the energosoma, which is intermeshed between our physical body and the psychosoma. So the psychosoma is the body of emotions, the body of desires. It persists throughout our evolution for a very long time. So all the different physical bodies and all of the past lives we've had the same psychosoma. So hence we bring this package of traits and beliefs and traumas and good things from the past with us. Now, the free consciousness has been evolving in the same process that we all have. They've just got further down the track more quickly, and they now exist in the mental dimension, in the pure mental body, and that's what we're trying to just represent there on the right hand side of that picture at the bottom of the page. And so in that state, right, words there like architect of galaxies, so the scale of the things they ponder about and are occupied with is like that. So it's kind of like, yeah, okay, helps us understand the level of complexity and experience that they have in evolution to be able to actually contemplate and be the point of incessant action as an evolutionary catalyst for millions / billions of other consciousnesses. So it's a theory. It's to a point able to be experienced. You can encounter free consciousnesses. You can have projections in the mental soma. Perhaps easier said than done, but it is possible. And so, there's another challenge for us all to try to engage with. Can we go to the next slide? And again, the free consciousness simultaneously perceives all the consciential dimensions where we manifest in a whole and intrinsic consciential manner. And just on that, the more we understand the reality of the free consciousness, the greater will be the excellence of the quality of our projects and our proposals here in this life, in view of our immediate future. And again, it's an inevitable goal. Thanks for that. Can we move on? Self-disoma, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on these next few pages. This is a way where a consciousness determines through techniques and methods a painless and conscious way of provoking the deactivation of this physical body. It's obviously quite a complex subject because it's very complex to interpret. And how do we know that we've actually done that at the correct moment, assuming we're able to do it? and not provoked the death of our soma before the correct moment of its biological death. So there's two kind of types. There's a cardiocharcral one and an umbilical chakral, or a voluntary self-combustion. And besides those two types of self-death soma, there's obviously a number of negative methods that can be employed. So jump to the next page. Please, next slide. There we go. And so it's only healthy when it's understood to be positive, and it occurs according to cosmoethics, with projectors who are at the 17th, or now the 13th in the more updated research stage. And so that is like the Serenissimus, which is another whole topic of conversation we can talk another day about, but very evolved, mature, aware, continuously aware in multiple dimensions, and with fantastic control over all of the aspects of the physical soma, the brain, all the other mechanisms. And so, obviously, relatively hard to encounter those consciousnesses and find them. But there are, in this book, I think in a later chapter, there are a number of examples of a few who are given. I think we'll jump onto the next chapter or next page if we can.
Can I just check something, ask something, Jeff, though, just to make sure I understood correctly? Did you are you saying that the only consciousnesses who can, I guess, cosmoethically decide to end the life of their physical body are Serenissimus?
That's the suggestion, the idea that is represented in the book. Yeah. So like it's based on an awareness thing, and so otherwise, how do you know, if you're not aware of all the functioning of the body and all the karmic consequences and all that, how do you know the correct moment to cease the action of the physical body? It's super complex, and I'm not sure many people have the knowledge to be able to time that one to the correct, moment.
I mean, I guess, it's a super complex question, but I think the thing that I'm thinking of, there's I don't know if you know the Buddhist author Thich Nhat Hanh. He's quite a well-known Zen Buddhist writer and peace activist and so on. He was discussing this issue in a way. He was commenting on, there was a number of cases in Vietnam of Buddhist monks killing themselves by burning themselves, right? By
Self-immolation,
pouring fuel over themselves and then lighting themselves. But they are doing this in a state of, like, they're going to meditation posture and they're lighting themselves, and they are sitting there completely peacefully as they burn to death. And he compares that with other activists around that era, Europeans usually, who would try to do the same thing, but then, die in terrible suffering and shouting and in agony and all that. And so it's just, he was making that point in a way, right? Like that there are people who have that knowledge, that capacity to essentially, they know that they're not their body totally with full self-awareness, and they make that choice.
Yeah, I think it's quite a different case. They're protesting, they're doing that as an act of protest, right? And so they're using some ability to kind of temporarily disassociate from the body, and control the brain, right? But they could well be projected, and then they're sitting there calm or whatever. But anyway, I think they're using it in a way I wouldn't really recommend, to be honest. Like, I don't think you could correlate it tightly to say that, oh, they're at, like there's Serenissimus is there who are just sort of like burning the physical body. Like, I don't see that in the same context. And also, it's not like a self-death soma. That's way more like a suicide. Like, there's ways of deactivating the body far more peacefully than pouring petrol on yourself and
or making that choice, right? Today is a good, like,
and there's peaceful ways of doing it. Like, you take a pill, like, I know some good friends who they're like, I'm happy to take a pill when the time comes and just end it. But again, is that the correct time for that physical body to die? Like, a certain amount of energy is given into the body for our life, and we want to use that wisely. And then if there's still a lot of energy, but we're just deciding now I'm out because of whatever reason, I'm not sure that's a particularly, smart choice in terms of, like.
I agree. I think there's many things to consider. There's karmic purposes, like if you're wanting to end your life because you're suffering, but actually there is something to gain for you from the suffering, but you don't know that right now, you don't see that right now. There's many like that, but I suppose I don't think people have to be Serenissimus to be able to end their life peacefully, right? Whatever the karmic repercussions of that are, I guess we don't know anyway. We don't know if they know.
Yeah, look, like as you can see at the end of that first paragraph there, like Waldo, he positions himself pretty clearly about stuff, and it's sort of like, without deactivating peacefully and this or that, without the true awareness of an awful lot of things, then you consider it reprehensible, negative, and anti-cosmoethical. And so, if you want to be sort of radical, you can, well, not radical necessarily, but if you want to be pretty stringent about the interpretation of the idea and the possibility, it sort of intends to try to value human life a lot and not too much wriggle room in terms of how do we interpret that to sort of say, well, that guy did the right thing, I agree with the cause and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, but it's tricky stuff. But I don't want to sit and dwell on it too much longer. So if it's okay, can we move on? This one again, it's like a way of provoking a deactivation of the body. There was an example. If we have some doubt about the possibility of people being able to do this, like it's just a control, like a control of the heart and an impact through the use of energies. And obviously, there's a recent example where there's an American football player actually got a usual tackle, but just the timing and the position, the thing was so wrong that he ended up having a cardiac arrest on the field and is still suffering these consequences. So it's just a timely reminder of the fact that it's actually relatively easy to do. We'll jump to the next page if we can. And so I'm rushing through this, guys, just so we have more time to chat later. I do appreciate there's lots of good comments in the chat, though. And again, here's a voluntary self-combustion, so it doesn't involve pouring gasoline over ourselves, just to make sure we're clear on that one. This is you generating a change in your energies, and the body spontaneously self-combusts. And it describes here a few little details around that, but I'll leave that if you're interested to read in the book later on yourselves in more detail. Can we jump to the next one? Okay, these last few chapters were, I think, kind of, at least for me, more interesting. This psychophysiological anchor, and Dave, yes, it is early here, isn't it? And we are still lacking coffee. The psychological and or physical element that maintains the consciousness of the advanced projector connected to or interested in human life. So the challenge with having projections and having a very different array of experiences available to you, very rich and diverse and kind of extremely liberating and different, is you can become alienated to life on Earth. Like life on Earth becomes quite boring, heavy, slow. Like if I want to walk across the room, I've got to literally get up and, out of the body, you fly across the room, you fly around. It's way more liberating. So the idea being that in this case, there's some anchor, there's some point that helps to keep you interested and engaged in the intraphysical life and life in the physical body. And at the bottom of that, the third point there's 10 different examples of anchors. And it could be to do with family things, the adoption of a domestic animal, collecting educational things, scientific research, elevated art, athletic stuff, all sorts of other things there. But this idea of having an anchor to avoid being alienated as you project out of the body more and more is an interesting one. Can we jump to the next page? Thanks, guys. And so you can become quite euphoric having these out-of-body experiences. And so the idea being that this anchor would help to neutralize the euphoria regarding the extra-physical dimensions. I think we can jump to the next page. So this one here on the consciential locations, the state or condition wherein the consciousness temporarily anchors, concentrates, centralizes its focus, fulcrum, seat of action, or the locus of its perceptive faculties in a certain evolutionary opportunity or moment. It goes on to say later on in the chapter, the two cerebral hemispheres merely represent the visible point of the immense iceberg that constitutes the real consciousness, which is silently submerged in other existential dimensions. It also always has a seed or fulcrum of manifestation on any given occasion. The more evolved a consciousness is, the more frequent and more intense will be its changes of location. This is kind of an interesting concept to, it's connected with the idea, I suppose, of to a degree of mindfulness, but also with these evolutionary approaches to it. So, you know, me being here in Miami, unusually for a work thing, on the day that we're presenting this thing, where the calendar was organized 2 years ago and we didn't even know I was going to be here. And then the number of synchronicities that I've seen as part of this journey that I've been on here, and obviously we'll be heading back to home in Australia next week, but I've noted like 5 or 6 different synchronicities during this trip. And I'm sure there's more that I just haven't picked up on, but there's some interesting stuff there as to understand, well, why. And Dave and I have been in the same time zone as we're presenting and so on, which is usually not the case. Anyway, let's jump to the next slide if we can, guys. We talk here, Waldo talks about this technique of using one finger, like, so there's your finger, right? It's physical, it's there. And then he's like saying, well, you could have basically countless number of other fingers in the same space, multidimensionally speaking, right? And you might at first dismiss that as being, well, silly, but if you think about it more and more and more, your mind will slowly start opening to the possibilities and the consequences and the influences of that. And in terms particularly of the focus of your attention and the degree of interaction with the other, say, 900,000 fingers in this particular space there. Anyway, it's a wee technique that's there that I thought was interesting. Can we jump to the next page? And I should just say, obviously, there's so much more content in these chapters, and I'm super paraphrasing, but that's the challenge we've had throughout the entire book club, right? There's so much content. So just mention here, lucid projection constitutes a consciential continuum or a constant succession of altered states of uninterruptedly amalgamating, interpenetrating, and alternating themselves. And the analysis of the phenomena of lucid projection, it will inevitably be accepted that the consciousness cannot be compartmentalized insofar as it doesn't divide itself. So you can't split your consciousness. You are that point of intelligence, of manifestation, and whether you're in this dimension, in this body, or in one of those other bodies we mentioned earlier, somewhere else, and your focus and is there, then that is you as all your consciousness. Here in the physical body, we tend to not remember everything. From when we come back, because of the density of the body, it's not always an easy process, but we can improve our memory and our ability to recall those things. I'll jump to the next page. This one is like this consciential dislocations, the act or effect of the conscious moving from one location to another. Me to Miami, you to the other side of the room, you down to the beach, whatever it may be. And they can occur according to the vehicles of manifestation and the environment and the dimension of life. So interdimensional. So thinking when you're out of the body as well, consciential dislocations is when you're moving from one density, region, extra physical community to another. So Waldo comments here is that, in general, we ordinarily manifest through our least evolved consciential vehicle. Bit of a kick in the pants, that one, bit of a shame, but there's a reason for that, because if we don't master this one, the complexities and the subtleties, and to use the more evolved ones better, the challenge is beyond us, right? I mean, sometimes we're challenged to use this body properly. Lucid projection tends to be a more evolved state than the physical waking state. Desomas are the discarding of less evolved vehicles. Therefore, in theory, they constitute evolutionary advancements by the consciousness. Can we go to the next page? So the extra-physical conscious lives in the condition of errantry within its community. I like the word errantry. I didn't remember what it was or know what it was, and it's about wandering. So wandering around in your community or in the extra-physical condition. There's even interconsciential intrusion. It's just a side point of an intraphysical consciousness upon an extra-physical consciousness. And every parapsychic communication is an intrusive process in terms of the sensitive's consciousness. There we go. We'll jump to the next page. So consciential nomadism, I was very happy to read this chapter because I always thought being a nomad, like it's not good. And I've tended to move around a fair bit in life, and I sort of feel like, oh, maybe it's not the way to do it, but hope springs eternal. So nomadism is the healthy condition of the consciousness when lucid and errant, again, wandering, which constantly moves itself from one locus to another in search of experiences that are enriching for its evolution. Yeah, I'll take that idea. I like that one. Does not constitute any pathological disturbance, deviation, strain, disorientation, oversight, or aimlessness, even of a projected consciousness lacking a mental target. On the contrary, it's the result of the hollow maturity of the consciousness, which intentionally becomes nomadic with lucidity through the powerful impulsion of its own will.
I mean, that's definitely what's happening in your case, Jeff. I think that's...
Yeah, mate. Probably not all the time, unfortunately, but we'll try and get there. We'll jump to the next page. So the more evolved the consciousness is, the more errant it becomes.
Can I just check is this talking about us living in different parts of the world, or is this talking about us projecting all over the place? Is this physical errancy or extra-physical errancy?
No, it's my understanding is my understanding was it was more physical, but it goes exactly the same rule in my interpretation of projected experiences as well. So the more projected you are and the more you are going seeking different experiences that are educational and beneficial and assistential and helping you evolve, same is my interpretation. So the more evolved the consciousness is, the more nomadic, and at the same time, the more serene they become. Imperturbable consciential dislocations occur. Its serenity doesn't signify inertia, indifference, or disinterest, but consciential energetic activity, growth, and realization. This makes it so that the address book becomes a very large library, and its degree of communicability reaches conscientiae. So that's referring more to those more evolved states of consciousness manifestation, the scale that we talked about earlier. And obviously when it starts mentioning things around serenity, that's when you start touching more on the Homo sapiens Serenissimus, which I believe we will cover in later chapters in more detail. We jump to the next page. So the more infrequent and non-lucid its projection of the consciousness are, the more distant the consciousness will be from the condition of consciential nomadism. The more frequent and lucid its projections of the consciousness are, the closer it will be to the condition of consciential nomadism. It exalts the continuous self-evolution of the purpose, opening up to fellow beings through mega universality, impelling the intraphysical consciousness to make political unification of the global reality. So this is like a future world state where we're all a bit nicer with each other. The defense, or a lot nicer in Putin's example. The defense of ecology and the omninatural mind, for example, its purpose that the person assumed the triangular interaction of the human, animal, plant as a social being, proposing a mutual domestication of human and subhuman intelligence. So we're talking about concepts that, you know, kind of mind-opening, but for me, for example, I love that kind of talk. That's like my right in there where I think I need to be in some way, trying to get there, to make those things happen, at least in some way. It reaffirms the stateless character of a consciousness, or the compulsory and inevitable inseparability that exists between all things within evolutionology. I think that might be coming up to the end. Can we go to the next one? There we go. I'm not sure how we're tracking for time. I'll leave that up to our good moderators and controllers of such things to determine whether we go to breakout rooms or what we do. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Dave. Thanks for a really great presentation. Yeah, as in terms of time, we probably won't have time to do breakout rooms. But what we'll do is we'll stop the recording now or just pause it. And maybe we'll have like a group discussion. So anyone wanting to ask questions, make comments, or just share some experiences or talk about anything you want to, we can do that now.
Now we are gonna talk. I'm trying to share the technique for this month, but seems that is difficult. So the technique will be a psychological conditioning technique. It has a lot to do what we were talking about. It's just like seeing your conditioning, how your conditions before you do the technique. So open up yourself, concentrate. You can concentrate. Oh, thank you, Michiko. So you can concentrate your those things now, your thoughts, energy, and in projection. Think about it. Also, gradually feeling your body like it not longer exists. Is the idea of being in the universe, no? And being this absolutely silence. So it's more or less condition yourself to this projection, okay? So I'm not gonna read everything here, but you can see. So this is the technique for the month, and then I'm gonna try to share again. Let's see if Michiko, can you share the paper also, the bioenergetic
Is it a chapter?
the workshop? So
I'll stop sharing. Hold on.
Yeah. So we are gonna have a bioenergetic workshop in Adelaide. Will be in May 6 and 7 of this year. So everyone is invited. And also we invite you for our next the Bridge Book Club that will be in the 18th of February. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, Jeffrey and David. If you want to say something before we close, please be our guest.
Thanks so much everyone for participating, and the enjoyable questions that we had and debate, and until next time, be well.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks very much, everyone. It's lovely to share the time with you guys all.
Thank you all. It was good to be here again. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.